So I think we'll start now. So good afternoon for everyone joining us in Australia and good evening for our New Zealand guests. Thank you for joining us for our first UOW Antarctic Futures seminar. This seminar series runs alongside the exhibition that is being displayed at the University of Wollongong Gallery and children's activities hosted by Early Start until October the 19th. For more information, please see our website. I am Melinda Waterman from the University of Wollongong, and I will be hosting today's session on behalf of the Antarctic Futures organising team from Dharawal country. We acknowledge and respect the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. Country for Aboriginal peoples is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships. We acknowledge and respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians, and recognise their rich culture, heritage, and continuing relationship with the lands and waters. We acknowledge the custodianship of the Aboriginal peoples of this place and space that is kept alive, the relationships between all living things. Now, I'm very delighted to introduce our first speaker, Professor Barbara Bollard from the Auckland University of Technology, or AUT. I am particularly excited about today's presentation as Barbara and I have worked together in the lab and in the field in Antarctica. She is the director of the AUT Drone Lab, and we'll be talking to you today about using drones to explore Antarctica. There will be time for Barbara to answer your questions at the end of her talk. Whilst Barbara shares some of her amazing Antarctic adventures with you, feel free to post questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This can happen at any time throughout today's session. This presentation will be recorded and will be available on the Antarctic Futures website. Please welcome Barbara as she shares her screen. Thank you very much, Barbara. It's all yours. Excellent. I can see your screen now, Barbara.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much for having me to speak on this very first occasion. I'd first like to talk to you about some of my work, and I'll take you on a bit of a journey tonight. And I hope you enjoy the imagery and the experience. I wish I could take you all with me and experience Antarctica firsthand. I'm going to talk today a bit about my research, drones in Antarctica, and the places we've been and some of the experiences we've shared. First up, I would like to talk to you about why Antarctica. I just make sure that my slides change. Yes. As a scientist, and I'm also a remote sensing expert, I have dedicated my research to the conservation of special places on our planet. And I can think of nowhere more important to our planet than Antarctica. I grew up in Seattle in the United States and have had my adult life mostly between New Zealand and Australia. But while I was growing up, it was always my dream to be involved in research in Antarctica. My professor in my undergraduate years at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, he inspired me with his stories of life at McMurdo Sound. He studied seals, and basically from that point on, I was hooked. I had ice in my blood, and I hadn't even been there. I had the absolute privilege to lead a team to Antarctica through a New Zealand research grant. And through that grant, the AUT Drone Lab has traveled to Antarctica most seasons since 2014 with our drones. I'm going to take you back now and look at how we get there. What is it like to go to Antarctica from New Zealand? Well, we all get to Christchurch. We have lots of gear, lots of clothing, and we travel by aircraft from New Zealand through the New Zealand program. The New Zealand program and the US program share aircraft. We travel usually on a Herc. That's what you can see in the background. You can see the bus that takes us to the Herc, and it's about an 8-hour trip. We jam-pack ourselves into this aircraft. As you can see here, there's not much room. So we sit there with the strapping. This is not luxury travel. All of our gear is down the center of the aisle. You can see the curtain at the back of the image. Well, that's where the toilet is. So there's a toilet, one toilet for everyone on the plane, and it's an 8-hour journey. Well, when you travel to Antarctica on the Herc, sometimes you get what you call a boomerang. And on this particular flight that you can see right here, we flew 8 hours, but we didn't realize somewhere along the way that we turned back and landed in Christchurch. So you can see there really aren't many windows on this aircraft, so it's very difficult to have the perspective of what's happening. We boomeranged, we landed in Christchurch, and the next day we started out again to try to get to Antarctica. So it's fun. After 8 hours and then another 8 hours, we start to get a bit silly. You have to wear earplugs when you're traveling, but we had a fantastic journey down to the ice. And there's this tiny portal window that everyone can take a peek out and look and see as you approach. As you start to arrive at the ice, I'm going to show you a bit of a slide of what a video of what it's like to land in Antarctica. You can see here we come in. We're getting close, and we're about to touch down on the Herc. So luckily this season we got a seat next to the window, and we were able to actually see ourselves landing. So in the New Zealand program and on this aircraft, we land on skis, which means that we can fly in and out all throughout the summer season. And here we are taxiing to our spot where we can all disembark. And there's the road that goes off to Scott Base and McMurdo Base. This is us getting off the plane, and there you can see the skis that the plane lands on. Again, we were flown down by the US Air Force, and this gives you a good indication of what it was like. And as you get out, it's unbelievable to arrive on a day with no clouds. It was glorious. And in the background behind the tail of the aircraft, you can actually see Mount Erebus. It was a beautiful, beautiful day. Well, once everyone gets off the actual aircraft, you then go on Ivan, the Terror bus. And Ivan takes you to Scott Base first, and then off to McMurdo for the Americans. So the New Zealand program, you can see going up the stairs, the person with the orange jacket on, with the penguin on the back and the silver fern, and then the American outfit is a red outfit. So I'm just going to take you to Scott Base now and tell you a bit about life at Scott Base. It is incredible. In front of Scott Base, you can see the green buildings. It is the iconic color that they use. And in front of it, you can see the sea ice. So that's where you often get seals popping up. I can see some seals in front of Scott Base. They're just like little brown blobs on the sea ice, if you have a look. This is from the top end of Crown Point, looking down over Scott Base itself. Scott Base is being redeveloped, so that appearance will change in the coming years. But I think the decision was made recently to keep the green color. Sometimes it snows when we're there, and that's what it looks like when it's snow. Of course, we tend to go in the summer season, which is when we have the most ground exposed, and we have 24 hours of our daylight. In the foreground here, you can see this little orange and yellow hut. I'll talk about that at the end of this slideshow. That's actually a historic hut that Sir Edmund Hillary had built for the Trans-Antarctic Expedition, the TAA hut. And it's been fully restored to the appearance and to all the books and everything on the table as it was when he was there. That's a very special place that I know that Melinda spent a lot of time in. Again, this is what it's like at the base, just incredible scenery. You can go for beautiful walks around the area. We have many researchers that are involved in marine work, but of course we're involved more in the drone work. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. Scott Base is warm. It has beautiful views out over the sea ice. It has a very home feeling, and it's a very special, special place. And if you have a look here, this is our lab area where we can work on our drones when we first arrive at Scott Base, so that we can get them set up and tested and do our work. So the question you may ask is, why in the world do I use drones in Antarctica? Well, drones offer the ability to undertake rapid surveys that are low impact. So they can be undertaken without entering or with minimal impact to protected areas. They're very precise, they're very accurate, and they allow you to repeat these same surveys time after time, thus making it a bit more affordable than sending in large teams to survey areas. Our surveys have provided quantifiable information on human impacts, as well as changes in natural variability. We can use them for the potential of looking at climate-induced changes. Since 2014, we've developed and implemented these drone-based methods for really mapping high spatial and high spectral resolution maps. And we're making maps of coastal and terrestrial habitats at several very special conservation areas. We've done, for example, drone surveys of Scott Base to prepare for the redevelopment of Scott Base, to figure out the cut and fill and some of the estimates that were needed, to look at where the special vegetation was around the base prior to more disturbance. We've also done some drone surveys of and LiDAR surveys and photogrammetry surveys of historic huts, and those have been used for virtual reality applications, and I'll talk about that at the end of my presentation. There are some challenges using drones in Antarctica. The amount of gear is one of them, but the one thing that these multi-rotor drones, they use compasses, and magnetic compasses don't really work properly at high latitudes. So for example, from where we are at Scott Base, almost everything is north, and that's difficult when you're navigating by that compass. And these multi-rotors rely heavily on those compasses to fly, particularly when we're flying for photogrammetry or for surveying. And that means that we fly automated waypoint navigation. Sometimes another challenge is that it snows. So most of our work in these Antarctic specially protected areas is trying to find vegetation. And we've had days in the dry valleys where I didn't expect snow, but it does snow, where all that vegetation has been covered with snow. And these drones are wonderful, but they can't see through the snow. So on those days, we just take a day off and think on this particular photograph, that was day 21 in the field. So it was actually quite nice to have a day off. Another challenge is the absolute remoteness. I don't know if you can see the two people in the picture, but the scale of the landscapes that we're surveying and the remoteness of these landscapes is phenomenal. You can be the only two people out in the entire area, and you don't actually, your sense of scale is completely challenged. The other challenge, of course, is the cold. Imagine doing science in the cold. This is a very warm day, and there's and it's actually, you know, probably minus 5 degrees, and you're trying to do your science work and at the same time not get too cold. There's a lot of walking involved, and you know, it's a very challenging environment. So we travel to sites, and from the New Zealand program, all of our sites that we go to in the dry valleys, we have to travel there by helicopter. So the challenge is fitting all of our gear into these helicopters. That's fine when we take off, but arriving can be also very challenging for the helicopters. As you can see, this is a beach site, and this is in an Antarctic, or right next to an Antarctic specially protected area. And helicopters have to come in, they're not allowed to go over water. They have to come in on the ground. So landing in this sort of environment is very, very stressful for the pilots. And this is our IBR aircraft, and this is us unloading at our site. The helicopter drops us and leaves us on our own. And to me, once we get dropped off at the site, the one thing that really stands out is that extreme silence. You know, all you can hear is the crackling of the sea ice You can hear the glaciers sort of almost heaving. And sometimes you can hear some of the wildlife that we are so privileged to see when we're there. For example, penguins. Sometimes penguins sound like humans chitter-chattering. So it's almost like this noise of like, whoa, what's going on? What is that voice? And the skuas, we've had lots of encounters with skuas, and they make a lot of noise. And then particularly this beautiful creature we've had many encounters with. We're very lucky to see the seals. And again, this is one of the reasons that I was so inspired to go to Antarctica as a young girl, thinking how special it would be to get to experience this. We nicknamed this one Todd. I don't know why we named him Todd, but he stayed at our campsite the entire time that we were there. We witnessed some amazing sights with the algae that's found and embedded within the sea ice, the glaciers, and just the sheer size and scale of the mountains surrounding us. This is where we camp. As you can see, it's, we're camping in a boulder field. It's glacial moraine. I wouldn't say it's luxury camping by any stretch. And we're often in these locations for, 10 days. And as you can see, there's a blue tent there, and I'm standing on the veranda. That's our cooking side. And then we have to cook our own food. We have to, I think I had just had a coffee at that point. And again, the little yellow tents are our sleeping tents. The blue tent is there, not for us. It's a heated tent. It is there to keep the electronics warm for the drones. And just to give you a bit of a reality check, in New Zealand or any other program, when you go to the toilet, it all has to go back to New Zealand to be disposed. So this is on the left, the toilet at one of the more luxurious campsites, because it actually was enclosed. At some of the other campsites, you just had to take your bucket behind a rock. And then what we do with the waste when we get back to Scott Base to process it to go back to New Zealand. But here we are flying drones in Antarctica. This is at an Antarctic specially protected area, and we are mapping the mosses and the vegetation that I'll show you some photos of in a minute. We fly both multi-rotor and we also fly fixed wing drones, depending on the landscape and depending on the area. This is just an example of one of the fixed wing drones that we fly. This gives you an idea of what it's like when the drone actually takes off and flies over and starts its waypoint mission. This is what we're looking for. Here's an example of some of the lichens that we find in our Antarctic protected areas that are in the New Zealand program. So one of the areas we went to is called Botany Bay. And there's 3 different types of lichens in this photo. Lichen is quite challenging to identify from drone. The orange ones and the yellow ones and the foliose ones are relatively straightforward, but some of the encrusting lichens are extremely difficult. And I'm hoping through my wonderful experience working with the team at UOW that we'll be able to get a better understanding of how those, being able to identify those lichens. We also are interested in mosses, and for New Zealand, this is an incredible moss bed. I know that other parts of Antarctica have much denser moss beds, but this is one of the southernmost lush moss beds that we can find. And this is one of the areas that we were particularly interested in. And this is where I showed you the photo of doing science in the cold, where Mel was doing her science in the cold. As you can see, some of the moss has been overturned, and that is from the skuas. They are a bit cheeky and get in there and overturn that bit of moss that you can see in front of you. While we're there, we do work. We do quadrats. Mel's got the quadrats in her backpack. The other two were doing surveying work. And just like with the Australian program, we have a field officer, and this is our field officer in this photograph. And he was lots of fun. To give you an idea of some of the products that we produce, this is hopefully you can see it. It is a model of the landscape where we were surveying those mosses at Botany Bay in the Antarctic Specially Protected Area. This is what they call a point cloud. So each point has data about the spectroreflectance of that particular point. So there are millions of point clouds points to create this cloud of data. The beautiful thing about this is you can zoom in and identify where the vegetation is located. And in this example, what I'm doing is showing you those yellow and orange areas or red areas are those areas that are very dense with moss and where you can identify it. So we can classify these points. So it's a fantastic technique, and we can do this for the entire protected area. From this point cloud, we then generate maps. For management purposes, the managers require maps of where the vegetation is. This Antarctic protected area called ASPA 154, which is Botany Bay, they wanted a map of moss density. Well, we're collecting with our drones moss density in about a 1 to 2 centimeter resolution. But for these management planning maps, I had to downsample that data to a 1 meter square resolution. But from these maps, they can then say, okay, these are areas that we don't want people to walk on, we don't want scientists to access. So we can see the areas that have the densest and richest location of mosses. We did this for both moss and lichens and for cyanobacteria. And this is what we do for the Antarctic New Zealand program. But what else do we do? Well, we've also been very involved in monitoring and mapping the historic huts that there are several of them in the New Zealand program. This is Scott's Hut. We've also mapped and done LiDAR surveys of Discovery Hut, and the expectation is we're soon going to be also doing Shackleton's Hut. I'm going to talk about one of those huts because with Mel, we did do quite an amazing experience. We did a VR experience of Sir Edmund Hillary's hut, or the Trans-Antarctic Expedition Hut. So I showed you at the beginning in our pictures the picture with the yellow and orange hut. What we did with this is we scanned the exterior. We used drones to do the exterior scans, but on the interior, we used a LiDAR scanner and photogrammetry with thousands and thousands of photos. And through that, we created a virtual reality experience. We did this in partnership with the Antarctic Heritage Trust. And Mel will share with you a link at the end of my presentation on how to access the virtual reality experience. You can use your phone to have a look at it as well. So what did we do? We took photos, we did LiDAR scans, we tried to embed narratives about the historic heritage. We found iconic samples that we could then say, okay, that has a story around it, and told stories through the virtual reality. We're very, very privileged in the middle of one of the lockdowns in New Zealand to have the Prime Minister launch our product. And it's being sent to Wollongong, so you'll have the chance to experience it as well. So what we loved about this is that we got to tell stories around what was the science and the research that Sir Edmund Hillary's team were doing. We had that sense of exploration. You know, everyone that goes to Antarctica has that sense of exploration. We continue the story of being explorers, but the early historic explorers, you know, such as Scott and Shackleton, and then later it was Hillary, you know, they brought this amazing adventure with them. And we also, through the VR, shared a bit about the lifestyle. What's it like to be in Antarctica? And hopefully I've shared some of that lifestyle with you as well from our expedition with the drones. just to give you an idea of what we do, we've used the LiDAR scanner. We used the Faro at this time. And those little balls are not part of the hut. They're things that we put into the hut to actually reference the scanning, and so that we can tie scans together. They're registration spheres, and then we also had some grids that we put up on the walls. You make several laser scans of each room, and they're combined later through the data processing. And we were so privileged to have Mel with us to help with this process, because it was quite tedious and very, very time consuming. And I'm sure she can answer questions on this part of the work. We also took thousands of photographs, interior photographs, so that we could then, when we render it into the virtual reality, you had real textures and a real understanding of each of the artifacts. So to do that, you have to take thousands of photos, as I said. We scanned and did 3D scans of many of the historic artifacts, such as the mixer and the stove and the telephone that you may have seen, and the anemometer, which was one of the science equipment things that they use for looking at wind, and all sorts of other things as well. The kitchen items were used to look at food preparation in the 1950s, and we embedded some historic video footage into the VR, so that when you clicked on one of the kitchen items, you could actually see the men from the TAE expedition preparing their meal for Christmas dinner. I'll go to the next slide, because the next slide is a video of that experience. But the best thing to do is for you to go to the Antarctic Heritage Trust website and download the VR, or go on to Steam and play the VR yourself. But I'll just give you a quick glimpse as to what it's like. There is no sound, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be coming through, but hopefully you can get a feeling for what it's like to be in the hut. One of the most amazing things that I've experienced is taking some of the team that were on this expedition through this virtual reality. And this is Sir Edmund Hillary's son, Peter Hillary, who welcomes you to the hut. And that video is embedded in the hut itself in this VR. So it was really special, and it was a huge privilege for all of us that worked on this project to meet the people that were still alive that were part of this expedition. And you know, some of them had tears in their eyes when they experienced it, and when they looked at it, they said it was just like being in there. The only thing that's missing from virtual reality, in my opinion, is the smell and some of the sounds. As you can see, all of this is modeled and recreated. And as you click on things in the experience, it will launch a video. And these videos were provided through the historic archives of the actual men preparing their Christmas meal. We also were in their cloakroom, so you can see some of the clothes they wore. And here you can click on an image and see them driving the tractor. This Massey Ferguson is it was a very special part of New Zealand heritage and the New Zealand presence in Antarctica. He drove the Massey Ferguson to the South Pole. And again, there's many artifacts in here that we were able to scan and share. And here's looking through the binoculars, looking out at the seals on the sea ice. And the early scientists that were studying those seals on the sea ice, and some of the penguins, of course, as well. So we've started with Sir Edmund Hillary's. Oh, there's a painting to remind everyone what it was like back in New Zealand. And yeah, we started with this hut. This was one of our first virtual reality experiences that we've created. We're currently working on Scott's Hut, Discovery Hut, which those of you who have been to McMurdo would be familiar with Discovery Hut, because it's quite a feature of that landscape. And then our next two huts are going to be Scott's Hut at Cape Evans, and also Shackleton's Hut. So watch this space. And really, one of the take-home messages that I'd like to share with you is just the whole experience of the remoteness and the beauty that is Antarctica and the privilege it is to actually be able to experience these places and these special places. This was at the end of one of our missions, and I think we were so relieved to see the helicopter arriving because to take us back to Scott Base because a huge storm was coming, and we were extremely lucky to be evacuated in time. So I look at this photo and I think, oh gosh, we were so isolated and so remote, and it was really just an incredible opportunity to get to do research there. So I'd like to thank you and just share with you our lovely team. Antarctica and New Zealand have been very good to us and have worked with us over many years. This is our drone lab. Of course, there's students and everyone to help with the processing back home, but in the field, it's been Len and Ash and myself. And we are extremely thankful to have Mel as part of our team as well. And we work very closely with Neil Gilbert. Many of you who've been involved in Antarctic research know Neil quite well. So I have plenty of time for questions, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you about a bit about my experience with drones in Antarctica. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Barbara. That was a perfect beginning to our seminar series. So thank you very much for sharing the science, stories and snapshots. And for our online audience, please post any questions that you have in the Q&A box, or alternatively, you could raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question verbally. And I have a couple of people here in the room with me too, so if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand here. So we have a couple of questions already in the Q&A box, Barbara.
Wonderful. I can't see it.
I'll read them out to you. That's perfectly fine. So from one of our attendees, how do you overcome the reduced ability to rely on needle compass? Is there alternative navigation software you can use?
Well, I was extremely privileged to work with an engineer who wrote some software. We did not, as you can see, we're not using a closed system. He was able to program the autopilot to cope with the change in declination.
And we have another question. Sorry, Barbara.
That's all right. I hope that answered the question.
So I also have another question here in the space. Is there an opportunity for students to be on the team?
I would love to take students on the team. One of the, I think we all are aware, those of us that have been to Antarctica, it is a huge privilege to go. It is extremely difficult to get seats to go on the airplane, unfortunately. I think the thing that sort of made me most aware of the cost and how difficult it is that Antarctica and New Zealand shared with me some of the expense of sending people to the ice as far as logistics support. So it makes it look easier. You know, I flew down, we went out in the field, but if you look at everything that was done to support us as a team, you know, the aircraft down, the helicopter flights between sites, all those different things add up to cost. One estimate I've heard has been around $4,000 a day per person to support that person in Antarctica. So every opportunity I get students involved. I've taken PhD students down, and I always want to have students involved, but know that it's something that has to be planned and planned well in advance, because those seats are very, very special and expensive.
Yeah, it certainly is very expensive. So we've got a question from another attendee. Wonderful presentation, Barbara. Thank you. What opportunities do you see for drones in Antarctica in the future?
Oh, that's a great question. I see lots of opportunities. And there are many different types of drones. So, you know, longer range drones that can fly longer, I think could cover more area. Yeah, I've been involved in drone research in Antarctica since drones really were just up and coming. You know, we tested them, we flew many, many missions in New Zealand and in Australia prior to going to the ice, but it was still infancy in early days. Now, as the drones get better and better and more reliable, and we can overcome the compass issues, and with fixed wing drones, we don't have as much of a worry. It's really about covering more area. The benefit of drones to satellite is the resolution of the imagery and the fact that we don't have to deal with atmospheric corrections. So we'll never cover, satellites have their place. Drones are fantastic for Antarctic specially protected areas or things of that scale. And then drones that have much longer range will be used, they should be used more and more. And in redesigning Scott Base, I was asked for some input into the future of drones and how I saw drones being used in the new Scott Base. And one of the things that we discussed was, well, we should be able to, in the near future, fly to the airfield and launch the drones from there. And they can go to the dry valleys and cover the areas. And then further down the track, we could potentially launch the drones from Hobart or from Auckland, or not Auckland, but from Christchurch or Dunedin. So drones are a very important tool for Antarctic research in the future.
Excellent answer, Barbara.
A long answer.
It was really good. We have lots of questions about drones, funnily enough. We have another one on any challenges or difficulties you were facing when using the drone to do the survey or observation. That's the first part of the question.
Oh, I will answer that.
Yep.
I certainly can tell you about that. I think the extreme cold in the dry valleys, the first time we went down, the big lesson we learned was how cold it was. And I don't know if you can see in this photo, but the batteries are underneath the drone and they're in blue, encased in blue. I had to hand sew in the field, polar fleece, little socks for the batteries and hand warmers to keep them warm and to keep enough warmth in for when the drone started. Once you're flying, it's a different story, but the initial bit is you need to have the batteries quite warm. The very first season we went down, we realized that the GPS coverage wasn't great. So we had to go back with multiple GPS masts. And that was a problem. It's just because we're so far south. What are the other issues we encountered? I think the extreme cold, also, we had days that were -20, -30, and wind chill of probably -40. And that's when the camera triggers stopped working. So it was more the sensors, not the drones, that we had difficulties with. And probably the human factor. It gets really hard to work at -20. Yeah. And
definitely, those hands can get pretty cold.
Yes, they can. That is one of the things that I think, it's learning how to work in that cold is challenging. And also in the New Zealand program in the dry valleys, you could work 24 hours a day if you wanted to. And so that is also challenging to get your head around that and to make yourself stop and take a break.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Smart tips there. So following on from the question about the batteries, there was another question from someone asking about how well do regular lithiums hold up if you were to use them? And do you keep the batteries warm right up to the point of use?
We do keep them warm, and that's why we have a heated tent to keep all the electronics warm right up until we use it. We always calculate about a 15% decrease in our flight time, just to be on the safe side. And that's pretty much how we plan our missions, is just cut down our time, everything's warm. And we carry them. This is really embarrassing, but when we carry the batteries, we tend to carry them next to our body to keep them warm. So we look a bit strange, but we keep them as warm as we can.
That's right. It's fine to have all those batteries as close as you can to your skin.
Kind of walking around.
So I think we've answered one of the last questions that just came through. But one thing was, how do you manage power supply? How many batteries do you really need, Barbara, to operate these drones?
You need a lot. So you want to go and be able to fly as many flights as you can. Assuming a battery in the very beginning, when we first started taking drones down to Antarctica, the multi-rotor drones would only last for 10 to 12 minutes. So you wanted to have enough batteries to have multiple flights. But these days, the batteries, they last for over 30 minutes. So the technology has improved over time. And so we, initially we would have taken lots and lots of batteries. We pre-shipped them as dangerous cargo on the C-17s, usually with New Zealand, or with the US program. But now we probably don't need as many as we used to. I always like to go with the intent that if I'm going to hike, 5 kilometers, I'd like to at least be able to do 5 decent flights around that area. So that's sort of my mindset when I go out. So that's how many batteries I need, enough for that many flights.
That's a lot of batteries, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, now it's
we
not
have
as
another.
many. Now that we can fly for longer, we don't need as many for 5 flights as we used to.
So that related to a question asking about, could you use the drones to do repeat surveys of areas for moss and lichen distributions and track change over time?
Well, that is the intent. That is what we're hoping to do. So we plan our missions, we plan our flights based on the cameras that we use, and we basically can go back to those same flights over time and repeat those same surveys so that we can see it. Obviously, what's happening as well is drone technology has improved and the cameras have improved. So that's great. So as we go, we'll even have higher resolution spectrally and spatially, and we'll be able to cover more area. But we can go over the same area and create the same footprint.
And I think that answers a question from Noel about, he said, great talk, thanks. What science question are you answering with the moss and lichen drone samples? So you've just answered that we're looking at the cover. Was there anything else you'd like to add, or would you like me to give you a hand there?
Well, understanding the cover is actually really critical. I'm mostly involved in Antarctic research in looking at ASPA management and conservation management. So in doing that, it's really getting an understanding of the percent cover of the different, lichens, mosses, and cyanobacteria. I work, as I said before, with experts in different species. So working with Mel on mosses, and with Sharon and with a few others that are in this audience. And really, we all have our own level of expertise and our own topic of expertise. So we share, and through SAFE as well, it's brought a lot of us together, and we can share that knowledge. My expertise really is in landscape scale ecology and landscape scale remote, sensing. So hopefully what I do can bring value to those that are studying species and individual species. I hope that makes sense.
Excellent. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of people tuning in to more talks throughout the seminar series on moss. We have a question from Rebecca. Hi, Barbara. Thank you so much for your presentation. It looked like there was a high density moss field at the boundary of ASPA 154. Has there been discussion about extending the boundary to encompass that bed?
That is a great question. Yes, there has been. And I have been talking quite a bit with Antarctica, New Zealand about that. Yeah, and we noticed that as well. And we also noticed that there were moss beds really close to the tent site, and there's other species as well. So there's a lot of questions that I think we as a society need to ask about what are the appropriate boundaries for ASPAs. And I know that conversation is happening.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that question, Rebecca. We have a question from Dana about the sediment cover. So in the Vestfold Hills, also in Antarctica, Dana's found many of the mosses there are covered in sediment. Assuming the same happens in Botany Bay, how do we estimate cover error in drone cover assessment?
That's a great question, Dana. And in fact, I wouldn't say Botany was where we saw most of the sediment. And I would say it was definitely at Canada Glacier. And Mel, what would you agree with that? comment. We saw quite a bit of sediment.
Yeah, I would agree that there's a little bit of sediment in some areas that's basically broken down granite, but definitely at other types of protected areas. So one that Barbara mentioned, Canada Glacier, there's lots of cyanobacteria cover on top of the moss. So that becomes a little bit more difficult in assessing that cover.
Exactly. And one of the things that we do, we use multispectral sensing. So we're really looking for how the plants reflect light, and that will change as the sediment covers a moss bed. And how it changes is part of the science. It's really about understanding the reflectance over a range of conditions. So I'm particularly interested in where there is lots and lots of chlorophyll, and our sensors are targeting that. So we're looking for, you know, mostly healthy vegetation, but we can detect that. So that's using the multispectral sensors. But there's other sensors that we use, and we use these in partnership with the moss experts. So I have a feeling they'll probably dive into some of the sensors that they use as well. Won't you, Mel and Sharon? Yeah.
So
very
you
good
mentioned
question. I don't have a perfect answer for.
No, there never is a perfect answer, is there?
Oh.
So you mentioned a lot of the challenges that are faced using drones to do these surveys. Do you think if we flew 2 drones flying together, would that help any of these problems?
That's a great question. We're going into swarming drones now. I have all sorts of visions for swarming drones where we try and send smaller drones out over an area, such as they're using in agricultural applications to try and find, you know, pest plants or sick areas of plant. It is a possibility. I have not even gone down that path yet, but it is a possibility. You know, more
So we have
on the ground, basically.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Barbara.
That's all right.
So we have one last question, unless there's more coming through. This one is, are you surveying species outside of moss and lichens? And is it on the horizon or purely within the jurisdiction of other research programs?
I wouldn't say, I mean, basically, this remote sensing is a tool to support other research programs. So I have primarily been looking at mosses, lichens, and cyanobacteria, because those are the values that were protected for those Antarctic specially protected areas. So that is why we targeted that particular type of vegetation. I'm also very interested in other things, and working with Mark. I think I saw your name in here, Mark, and looking at, well, what is vegetation a proxy of? What are the other things we might find in a vegetated area? So drones could be used for that as well. Again, you know, it can be used for other things, but it really is a tool that should be used in partnership with other research programs.
Definitely. So I had a question about how long does it take to stitch a lot of the digital photos together to create that map of vegetation and topology?
Well, again, that's something that, you know, as technology improves, the time is coming down. When I first started, it was quite interesting. It took a long time. And when we first went to Antarctica, the very first season, we worked very closely with a company called Pix4D, which have now become global, but they were very tiny. They had 6 staff members at the time. And, you know, trying to stitch that together was something I had to actually go to Switzerland to do. Now we can do it pretty much in the cloud, and the time has just dramatically decreased from what we used to have to do. So what used to take months can now take days or hours. Really the processing speed.
Thank you. I've just got one question from the audience here.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Love your talk. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I was just wondering. I'm sorry. That's okay. I was just wondering, when you're in the field and you do a flight over an area, how do you assess that you're happy with the quality of the data and that you don't need to fly over it again?
Such a good question. We have processes in place for post-flight. So basically, I download all the imagery after every single flight and we check it. So first we check the number of photos we've taken. Does it make sense? Have we got as many as we were expecting, approximately? And at the end of the day, I'll do a quick process to look and see if we can stitch them and if there's any gaps in the data. So that was a great question. And that is just part of our daily, our routine that we've got, tick boxes, do you do this, this, and this.
Yeah, wow. That would add some time onto your day.
It does. That's why, as I was saying, 5 flights, I mean, you have to check because you don't get a chance to go back.
Yeah, we do as much work as we can. We're in the field, don't we?
Yes. It's like takes on another level. Another
Definitely.
level of data checking.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, Barbara, but that was an amazing discussion that we had with all of our attendees in terms of all those great questions that were asked and those from the room as well. So I'd like to thank you again for your great presentation. So we're going to put our hands together virtually and physically to say thank you very much for talking with us today.
Thank you.
Our next session in the seminar series is an Antarctic film night. So that's next Wednesday. This will be an in-person event, or it's scheduled as one, and light refreshments will be provided. So please check our website for all upcoming seminars throughout the Antarctic Futures event. So Georgia did post in the chat space the link for the Sir Edmund Hillary hut, that virtual reality experience that Barbara mentioned in her presentation. So feel free to click on that link and you can download the app through the Google Play or one of the Apple platforms and have a look at that. Even on your phone, you don't need the virtual reality headset at all to experience that. So again, I'd like to say thank you so much, Barbara. It's been a pleasure to have you talk to our audience today. And thank you everyone for joining us. I hope everyone has a good night.
Thank you so much. It was a real privilege. Thank you.